pattern making, my favorite part of the garment development process. I love taking this 2D shape and thinking about how it transforms into a 3D space. And whether I'm working with 3D software or actually sewing garments in real life, pattern drafting, it's my favorite part of the process. So this is part 3 of my undies series. In part 1, we took a fabric and we translated that into a digitized form. In part 2, we looked at my body measurements and turned that into a digital form, starting with the Clo3D default avatar. And now we're on to part 3, which is making the pattern for the undies that I eventually will be sewing. So essentially, today we'll be looking at both the pattern and what the 3D model of that pattern looks like. So I won't actually be drafting from scratch in this video. What I will show is how to bring patterns into Clo3D and then understand how that pattern relates to the 3D shape and the fabric that you're working with. I did learn how to draft from my friend and mentor, Sophia Luzon, who has an incredible course specifically about using Clo3D to draft underwear, starting with measurements, which I highly recommend. And I'll make sure I link that in the information box below. And if you're looking for a book recommendation, this is one. I always have it on my desk. It's Underwear Pattern Making for Underwear, designed by Christina Shin. And I always kind of have it around for reference because it's a great starting place if you are brand new to drafting patterns. Okay, so let's get into it. This is a basic block pattern that is roughly what I learned to draft in Sophia Luzon's course. The only difference is that this block pattern has 0% negative ease. And let me explain what I mean by that. So if I measure the waist of this pattern, so I'm just going to grab the waistband of the front and the back, so all of these lines. If I look over here in the symmetric line length, I see that the waist circumference on the pattern is 81.82. Now let's check that on the avatar. And we can see it's 81.92. So within millimeters, we're happy with that. So we know that the waist circumference of this pattern will match my waist circumference exactly. Now let's check the low hip circumference. Let's see what it is on the pattern. We have 92.05, and on the avatar, it's 91.91. So almost exactly the same for the low hip circumference as well. So the last thing we want to do is check the rise. I'll do that by using the palm tool this time. That's this tool right here. So select your palm tool and just go along the center front of the panty, the gusset, and the center back seam. Now, when you look at this yellow line in the 2D window, you just want to make sure that it's measuring exactly where you want it to measure. So for example, right here on the gusset, we don't want it measuring that. So I'm just going to click off into the gray space, and then I'm going to select the edit palm tool. I'm going to select that portion of the line and say hide length. And now that's measuring the rise accurately. If I look in the object browser up here, and then go to the palm tab right here, I can get to the point of measure, which says it's 60.19. And I'm just going to rename, I'm going to delete this one, and I'm going to rename this one rise. So on the panty, it's 60.19. Let's check the avatar. We want this one right here, which you can see goes from the center back waist through the crotch, and you can't see it, but it does come up through the center front all the way up to the waist, and it's 68.82. So my rise is definitely short on this panty. So let's adjust that now. 68.82 minus 60.19. So we need to adjust the rise by 8.63, and I'm going to bring back the panty, and you can definitely see that I need to increase it a little bit more in the front than I do in the back. So if I need to increase it by 8. I might increase it by 5 in the front and 3 in the back. So I'm just going to adjust it from here. I'm going to bring this straight down, holding the shift key by 5 centimeters. And then I'm going to do the exact difference, which was 68.8 to minus 60.19 is 8.63 minus 5. So I'm going to increase the back by 3.63. So I'm just going to grab this line here and straight down, holding shift 3.63. And then we'll just clean up these lines really quickly. So I'm actually just going to delete all curve points on this line and make sure that my front crotch still matches and my back crotch still matches, and my side seams. Let's make sure this curve fits nicely. So we just want a slightly smoother transition here. So I'm going to add a couple curve points. And then I'm going to just give it a slightly smoother curve. Then let's rotate that back along the green direction. And then we can simulate, see how this is looking. So I'm getting a lot of bagginess right here along the front leg line, which I think I can clean up right now. So I'm just going to use my fullness line tool, and I'm going to start somewhere in the waistband. Sorry, not the fullness line. I'm going to use the fullness point tool, start about there on the waistband, come down to the panty. And I'm going to reduce it by about 1 centimeter. And then I'll just clean up this waistband. And we'll see how that helps. Yeah, that's looking better. And I just have to bring back the elastic on the waist here. So I'll just clean up the pattern a little bit quickly. I might add a little bit more fill to the leg right here. And so there's a little bit of extra bagginess in the back here that I don't think is necessary right now. Now I know this garment generally looks baggy, and like I said at the beginning, this garment has 0% negative ease, and we're going to add in reduction as we go along. What we're looking for right now is just like a rough first draft that equals my body measurements. So let's add in a little bit of reduction in the back here. So I'm going to use the same thing, the fullness point tool, and I'm just going to decrease the back a little bit here. I'm going to decrease it by, I think, 2 centimeters in the back. Again, clean up the waist. And I don't want this arching up the way it is slightly, so I'm going to grab the whole thing and slightly bring it back down and add the curve back in here and get rid of these baselines. Okay, so now we can double check the palm, which is 68.8, and on the avatar, it was 68.8. So now our rise is good. So this means that I know that this pattern matches my body measurements exactly, and I'm confident to use it as a starting place to modify into a new style. Now, normally when you draft a pattern for a knit fabric, you draft it with a certain amount of negative ease, which means the pattern will be slightly smaller than the body because we're expecting the fabric to stretch to fit the body nicely. So I like to start with a pattern that has 0% negative ease so that I can really dial in the reduction I apply to the pattern based on the fabric that I'm using and also in consideration of the elastics that I'm working with. More on that a little bit later in this video. So this is the block pattern that I will be working with, but you might have a pattern that you already know works and you want to bring it into Clo. So there's a few different ways that you can bring patterns into Clo. And by the way, I've added time codes in the information box below, so feel free to jump around to the information that's relevant to you. My preferred method of getting patterns into Clo is to import them as a graphic image. So I just create a new pattern piece and I import the pattern as a graphic image. And this is what I did in my video where I made the cashmere Wyman dress sloper. And the nice thing about bringing in a PDF this way is that the PDF actually comes in at the appropriate scale. So you don't have to worry about actually changing the scale of the pattern when you bring it in. You can also take photos of your pattern and bring them in as bring in the graphic image as a photo, but you just have to make sure that you have a scale box applied somewhere on your pattern so that you can make sure that the measurements in Clo3D are reflective of the measurements that we have in real life. There's also a way of importing a AI/PDF file, a vector file straight into Clo. I haven't had any luck with this. It never works out for me, so I don't recommend it, but feel free to try it on your own and let me know how it goes if you do. Another thing that's really cool is that you can take if you have a garment that you really like, you can actually extract a pattern from that into Clo3D. And I made a whole video about this where I took an Arc'teryx jacket that I own and I extracted the pattern from the actual jacket, and I will link that below as well. And the last way you can import patterns is by importing DXF patterns. So import DXF. So these come from other pattern drafting software like Gerber or Lectra. You can usually get a DXF file from them. And these can come in with grading as well. So it's a nice option. You just sometimes have to play around with the import settings that you're using to get it to work for you. But just so you know, it's there. It's another way to import a pattern. So once we have the pattern that we're working with in here and we've cross-checked the measurements to make sure that it works for the body that the garment will be made for, then we want to start thinking about the materials that this garment will be made of and the design that we're trying to achieve. So in the first video of this series, I measured the stretch of the fabric that I'd be working with and I created a digital sample. Now, I know that this fabric has 20 to 40% stretch that it can comfortably accommodate. But one thing I didn't think about in that video was the elastics that I'll be using to finish the waistband and the leg line. So this will have a big impact on how much reduction I apply to the pattern, because even though my fabric might have a comfortable 20 to 40% reduction capacity, the elastics that I'm using might not. So if I have an elastic that only comfortably stretches at 10% and I apply 20% reduction to the pattern, that's not going to be very comfortable. The elastic will be digging in. So I went back into my stash and I picked out these two different elastics. This one's a plush picot. It's a little bit fuzzy on one side and not fuzzy on the other side. And this one's a fold over elastic. I just sewed it down with a zigzag stitch in the way that I would actually sew it on the garment so that I could take the measurement with the zigzag stitch and the fold over applied to it. Now for both of these, I decided that about 10% reduction would be a good amount, and I'm going to dive into this in a little bit more detail. So just stay tuned for that. So now since the elastic only needs a 10% reduction and the fabric I thought would use like a 20 to 40% reduction. I was worried that if I only applied a 10% reduction to the pattern, there might not be enough tension to hold the fabric nicely around my body. So I thought of some alternate solutions, and I thought maybe if I used a banded waistband made from the self fabric, the striped fabric, then I could reduce the whole pattern by 20%. And I mocked this up quickly in Clo. You can see on the left hand side is finished with the picot elastic. On the right hand side, it's finished with a striped waistband. And I definitely prefer the picot elastic. So I'm just going to go with a 10% reduction and hope for the best. So to apply a 10% reduction to the pattern in the circumference, what I'm going to do is just grab the pattern piece with the edit pattern tool, and I'm going to shrink it to 90% here. And I'm going to select OK. And I'm going to do the same thing on the back piece, 90%. OK. And we can simulate, and you can see it's already fitting her much, much nicer. So now we can think about the height of this garment. Because the fabric had 20 to 40% stretch, I do want to apply some reduction to the height of the garment just to make sure that we're, like I said before, maintaining tension around the entire garment. So we're going to do the same thing, except instead of just grabbing the marquee tool and adjusting the height from here, you can see that when I'm just adjusting it, it's not adjusting it proportionally. So what I need to do is double click this pivot point in the center of the garment, and now when I adjust it, you can see it's adjusting it equally from both the top and the bottom of the garment. So now I can adjust to 90% in height here, and here as well. I'm going to activate the pivot point and adjust to 90% in height, and I can simulate. Okay, so now I've adjusted the pattern for a 10% reduction in circumference and a 10% reduction in height. So let's talk about the gusset. So first thing I want to mention, because I forgot to mention it in my avatar editor video, is that there is a new feature. Well, it's not that new, but a feature that was released earlier this year where you can adjust the crotch width. Actually, this was just released today where you can adjust the breast shape as well. So I want to play around with that in a future video. But here, I just want to note that you can adjust the crotch width. And typically when I'm making panties, I just max out the crotch width. It gives me more room to play with in that area. It's always too narrow anyways, even when it's maxed out. Okay, so now for the crotch, you'll notice that I didn't adjust the width or the height. That's because there's just I go by a standard width and length for the crotch. I usually use, this is just straight out of Christina Shin's book, and I usually use 7 for the width of the crotch. So let's see if I have that here. Yep, 7 for the width of the crotch, and usually around 12 or 13 for the length of the crotch. So we leave those measurements the same, and we'll adjust the pattern to fit. So I'm just going to grab this line and this line. I'm going to say match up, match measurement, and we want it to the long one, and I want to make sure that it is going from the end. So I'm just checking my window to make sure that's what I want, and I'm going to select yes, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the back. So this is a little bit different because it's a curved line. So what I'm going to do actually is copy this line, and then I'm going to paste it. I'm going to replace line here, and then I'm going to say from the end, and I'm going to flip it horizontally so that it's the exact same curve as the gusset. Okay, so that is the pattern. This is our block pattern now reduced 10% in circumference and 10% in height. One more thing that's really cool that we can do in Clo is check the crotch placement. So if I just turn her to a mesh, now I can see exactly where the crotch is. Now I can see exactly where the gusset is sitting We can turn this to random colored surface. And I just want to make sure that the gusset is generally sitting in the right place, which it looks like it is here. Okay, so that is my basic block pattern made. I'm confident that this pattern is accurately representing my body size and shape, as well as accounting for the fabric and the elastics that I'll be using in this garment. So next we're going to start adding some style lines. But before I do that, I'm going to copy it and paste it over here. I should have actually done this before I made the reductions to this pattern so that I had a copy of the 0% reduction pattern, but do as I say and not as I do. So I'm just going to give this one a new fabric, and then I'll apply it, and I'm going to call it block 10% reduction width, circumference, and height. Okay, so, and I'll also archive this one so it doesn't get in the way. Okay, so that's that one. And now we can start thinking about the new style lines that we want to apply to this one. Okay, so thinking about what I want to do with the style lines of this, I want a basic low waist brief with full coverage in the back, and maybe I can do something interesting with the style lines and these stripes. So normally I would start with a sketch or some kind of reference image, but I already have an idea in my head of where I want to go with this. So I'm going to skip that step for now. But a fun side note, this is actually how I first got started in freelancing. I was doing sketches for intimate apparel, independent pattern makers. So that's just a fun side note. Looking at this pattern, I know that I want a low waist panty. So the first thing I'm going to do, first I'll get rid of this internal line. And I'll also turn this on to textured surface so we can see what's happening with the print on this, or not the print, but the lines on this pattern. Okay, so I want to lower the waist, and I know I want to lower it by about 7 centimeters. So I'm going to offset as internal line, and I'm going to go 7.5. And I'll do that in the back as well. And then I'm going to cut these off and delete them. And I'm going to add the elastic back to the waistband. So that's generally the rise that I'm looking for. I think I like that. So now I'm going to add some elastic that's actually, instead of this green line that I have acting as the elastic right now, I'm going to add an actual pattern piece that's going to be the elastic. So I'm going to add in the elastic. If you just go to fabric, you'll find it under elastic, and I'll use a knitted elastic. And I'm actually going to add 2. One is going to be picot elastic. And the other one will be fold over elastic. Okay, so I made 2 different elastics because these elastic have slightly different physical properties. And you can access the physical properties by selecting the elastic in the object browser and then coming down into the property editor, where you will find physical properties right here. So now we have under detail, strength 75 and stiffness 70. And I never really understood exactly what these values were supposed to mean because they only make sense relative to themselves. More than 75 is going to be a stronger elastic. Less than 75 is going to be a less strong elastic. So what does this mean in comparison to the actual elastics that I have in my studio? Okay, so bear with me now as I take us off on a bit of a tangent as I try to understand the physical properties of the elastic material in Clo. To do this, I went on to the Clo Discord and I asked. And if you haven't ever been on there, I highly recommend it. It's a great resource. It's monitored by Clo3D employees. So often if they don't have the answer for you, they will go and try and find it for you, which is exactly what happened here. So huge shout out to Ariel, who helped me answer this question, and the developer that she had reached out to. All right, I'm just going to pop it up in the window here, the conclusion of this chat. Basically, the number that is in Clo is a measure of force over distance, which is Newton's second law of motion, because I looked that up. And what we need to do is figure out how we can measure that and convert it into a unit that makes sense in Clo. Now, if you didn't know, Clo has this fabric emulator mode that you can go in, measure your fabrics with this special fabric kit with these specialized equipment that you can only access as an enterprise user. But I'm kind of obsessed with this. So I've been trying to figure out how to do it on my own for a while. So this is something that I definitely will be making a video on in the future. But because I've been playing around with this, I have acquired this digital force gauge. And with the digital force gauge, I can measure newtons. Now, if we go back to the chat, you can see that if I'm able to measure newtons over a particular distance, I can come up with a value that I can enter in Clo based on this equation. So I know the elastic needs to stretch from 80.5 to 89.5. So I just hooked that up to my digital force gauge. At 80.5, it has no tension applied to it, and I stretched it until that same point was at 90 or 89.5. And then I recorded the newtons, which was 1.23. So now it's just a matter of simply converting this equation into the units that make sense in Clo, and I'll just pop that up on the screen right now. So we basically need to go from kilograms to grams and meters to millimeters, which gives us a strength value of 110,700, which I can enter in the stiffness section here under strength, which gives us a value of 28. And now this kind of intuitively makes sense, because if you're thinking about elastic, the range of elastics that are out there, a picot elastic that's meant to be used in lingerie is going to have less strength than something that you would say use on the waistband of a pair of jogging pants. So intuitively, this seems like a reasonable number. Okay, so what about stiffness? In the Discord, Ariel also sent me this PDF document with lots of good information about elastic. But this image here is what I referenced to figure out the stiffness value. So basically, this is what the drape of the elastic looks like over my wrist. And if I reference this image, 35 is still stiffer than how my picot elastic is draping. So I'm going to use a number that's less than 35. And I'm just going to go with 20. And I feel like that's the best that I can do for now. But I still think that gets you in the right ballpark. Now, I did basically the same thing for my fold over elastic. And so for fold over elastic, I came up with a strength of 9,300 because it's not as stiff as the picot elastic. And I'm just going to use the same stiffness value of 20 here. Okay, so once you have your physical properties for your picot elastic and your fold over elastic, you want to give them some visual properties. For picot elastic, I have an image that I took and I turned it into a seamless repeat. I'm just going to drag this over here into base color. This used to be called texture, but now it's called base color map. And I'm going to create a pattern piece that is the width of my waistband. So I'll have to check that again in a second. And the height, we're going to use 1.2. And the width should be the symmetric length of this line, which is 81.58. And then we're going to make sure picot is applied here. And then we're just going to use the edit texture tool to find the picot. We're going to turn it around. We're going to scale it down. And we're going to offset an internal line by 0.2. And then we're just going to place this picot so the edge of the bottom of the picot aligns with that internal line. And then we can sew this on. So this, oh, before I do that, I have to create internal lines on my panty. So along the waistband, I'm going to create a 1 centimeter internal line, and then I can sew them on. And then I'm going to sew the internal line to the top of the panty. And then I'm going to make sure I close the elastic. And then I can superimpose under. And we'll do the same thing for the fold over elastic. I'm not going to change the texture because that's fine. I just want to change the color. And we're just going to use black. And then I'll create some internal lines to sew here as well. And these are going to be 0.5 centimeter. And in case you noticed, I did go in and change the way that this back curve was shaped, just because I didn't like the way it looked earlier. And then let me just clean this up as well. So now I'm going to create a pattern piece for the picot. Again, I have to check, I'll go back and check the width after. And then the height is going to be 0.5 centimeter. The width should be the length of the leg line, 55.84. And then we'll sew that on. This will go to the internal line. Oops. And this will go to the external line. And I'll just remember to close it. Then we'll superimpose over. And then Control D for the other side. And now I'll simulate and see, you can see I'm still getting the edge of the picot, but you can see the full width on the inside. Some people like to use a separate pattern piece. So if I went like layer clone over, and then I cut this away, and they'll use this as like their elastic piece. But as you can see, I won't be able to use the picot for this because it doesn't have a straight edge on it. So that's one reason that I don't normally like to use that technique. And the other reason is because this kind of messes with your grain line. For your elastics, you want to have a straight cross grain. And when you have these curves on the line, it kind of gives you some weird like bias, and I often have problems with the simulation for that. So that I generally try to avoid that technique if I can. And another technique, if I was just creating this to be just a visual file and not using it for the pattern, you could cut this piece away and just turn that piece into picot. But since I'm using this for a pattern piece, I like to kind of keep the pattern as faithful to a real sewing pattern as possible, unless for some reason I have to diverge. But that's why I do it with the method that I've shown you here just now. Okay, so here's what it looks like with elastic applied. Now, to get a more realistic understanding of the fit, I need to remove the elastic that I have applied to the edges of the panty. Okay, and then I can simulate again, and you can see it kind of relaxes into how the panty would really sit. And I am pretty happy with that fit. Yep, I think that looks good. One thing I wanted to show you was that, like, for example, if I used the elastic as it came in Clo with the properties that were applied, with the original properties of 75 and 70, and now I took these elastics and then applied the stronger elastic to it, it does have an impact on the fit. It's kind of hard to tell, but it is, you can tell it is stronger, and it does affect how the panty sits on the body. That's why I like to try to use the realistic physical simulation that I can. One more thing I want to do here is I want to change these to a particle distance of 5 and a geometry shape of quad, or a mesh type of quad. I find that just helps the simulation a little bit. So I'm going to go back to my picot that I created and fold over elastic here and simulate. And these guys need to be on top. And whenever, if it's starting to get twisted up like that, I just archive these, simulate, let the pattern smooth itself out. Then unarchive and before I simulate. And then before I simulate, I want to superimpose over again. I think this might partly be happening because I didn't turn the sewing lines. The easiest way to do that when you're doing something like this is to grab your pattern piece and then use this press tool, and then it will automatically turn all your sewing lines. Okay, so I can worry about the smoothness of the simulation a little bit later on as I keep working on this garment. But for now, generally I like the cut of it and where it's sitting. So now I can go to high res garment and make sure that I have skin offset at 0 and simulation quality fitting accurate fabric. And so this is giving me a pretty good idea of how this garment will fit. And I'm happy with the look of that. So I'm going to go back into low res garment. I'm going to create the style line that I'm looking for. So I'm going to cut it about there to there. I'm going to remove linked editing. And I'm going to cut and sew this. And then we're going to change the texture. So edit texture tool, line grain parallel to selected. We'll do the same thing here. Okay, so that's my basic low waist panty with relatively interesting style lines and a pretty full coverage in the bottom. So from here, the workflow can kind of go in two directions. You can take this pattern as you've created it and turn it into a pattern that you will use to print and sew with, or you can take this same pattern and make modifications that you need to make it a beautiful 3D render. And so I'm going to show you what a beautiful 3D render looks like with this, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to continue on with the workflow of turning this into a pattern that we can print. So let's just work in the 2D window now. Let's save this over here so that we can always come back to that version as required. And then I'm going to just archive it. And so in my 3D window, it's just out there in space so that if I ever want to come back to that version, I can. Okay, so to prep this for a printable pattern, there's a few things that I want to do. First, I want to add seam allowance. So I'm going to grab all the pattern pieces and I'm just going to add seam allowance. And now I'm going to, so it's already at 1 centimeter. So I want to just remove it from wherever I don't need seam allowance. So along here, the leg line, I don't need seam allowance. So I'm just going to delete it. The waistband will have fold over elastic. The waistband will have picot elastic. So 1 centimeter is fine there. And I'll just add it on to the end of my elastics as well. And I only need one of these leg line elastics, so we'll delete that. So now you can go in and add more details as required. I'm not going to add too much because this pattern is just for me and I generally understand how it goes together. Oh, I got to get rid of seam allowance here as well. But I could add notches, so I could use this walk pattern tool and walk these patterns and add a notch here to both patterns. So I know where everything matches up. I could add names to my pattern. So using the annotation tool, I could add front, right. And I can also change the name of my pattern. So if I go into the object browser here, I can find what this pattern piece is. It's this one here. And I can call it whatever I want. So I could add more details to it here. So A. And so if I turned on show pattern names, you would see whatever I have in this tab over here would come up on the pattern. So I'm going to turn off names and annotations for now. And one other feature that's nice in Clo is that I can make sure that these seam allowances match up nicely when I go to sew them. So I'm just going to flip this horizontally. And then, so these two front pieces would match up something like that. And then you would sew them along the seam line, but you can see that your seam allowances would match up kind of awkwardly here. So to fix that, you can select your edit seam allowance tool. Unfortunately, you can't select them when the two pattern pieces are on top of each other, which is super annoying. So you have to move them off of each other, edit seam allowance. And now you can change how the corner of this seam allowance looks. And you can figure out which one works best. And that's kind of as close as I can get it. So it's a bit finicky and you have to fiddle with it for a while. So when I'm preparing a pattern for somebody else, I'll take my time and make sure that those all match up nicely. But this is just for me. So I am going to just leave it. I'm going to leave them as is. Okay, so once I'm happy with this pattern, what I'm going to do is actually apply a new fabric to it. So we're going to select everything and we're going to apply this pattern for printing fabric. And then we're going to go into print layout mode. And then we're going to select that pattern for printing. And then we're going to hit play. And you can see it's now laid out the pattern for the width in the most efficient use case for the width of 44-inch fabric, which is nice because when I print this off and I put it onto my fabric, it will already be in the best layout. So that's nice. But I don't have to cut it out that way either, obviously, if I didn't want it that way. So from here, I can just go to the picture icon. I want one-to-one landscape mode. I don't need graphic lines. I don't need to show any images, but if you go to this drop down, you can see there's more options there. If they apply to you, you can check them on there. And additional information, this is where you can show pattern names and annotations and grain lines and anything else that you might want to show up on your pattern. And then when you select save, you have to make sure that you save as a PDF. And then open your PDF in Adobe Acrobat or whatever your favorite PDF file is. And then when you go to print, you just have to make sure that you have your scale at 100%. And I always create a scale box in my pattern. So I normally create a 5x5 centimeter scale box as a pattern piece. I forgot to do it this time, but what I can do is just measure like the width of my gusset to make sure that it comes in at the right scale. But in any case, if you have 100% selected here, it should be okay. I like to overlap my pattern pieces. I like to overlap the pages by 1/8 of an inch. And then you hit print and your pattern is ready to go. So that's the end of this very long YouTube video. In the next video, I will be sewing this up. So actually in the studio sewing. So I look forward to that. And I will leave you with a beautiful 360 render of what I did. And thanks for being here. I hope you learned something and I'll catch you next time. Bye.